We now hear from our second reactor, John Nery.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Allow me to respond to not only the topic of this plenary session, but also to the themes of the entire program. This has been a thrilling day. I've been following since morning on live stream. The first international conference on lawfare. But one disadvantage of being first, we have spent a lot of time wrestling with definitions. What exactly, several hours later, do we say to the question, do we answer to the question, what exactly does lawfare mean? This is an important exercise, but it can also be confusing. Professor Fox, anatomy of lawfare, negative and positive, I think would be an important step forward. I would like to suggest, and I hope that we can all agree, that we can gain clarity by asking a parallel question. Why are we talking about lawfare now? If the weaponization of the rule of law has been a brutal fact in history, why is it a strategy that today's authoritarians use? As Professor Falk notes, and our speakers this morning proved, we are experiencing a global trend of democratic backsliding. But instead of a sudden, swift collapse into authoritarianism, we are suffering a slow, gradual democratic erosion. Why? Because today's authoritarians have learned their lessons. They know that constructing a democratic facade can prolong their hold on power. That's where we are now. How do we combat lawfare? I don't have specific suggestions in mind, but I would like to recommend a framework for thinking about capacity building. I will borrow Zeynep Tufekci's framework for capacity building in social movements. We need to develop three strengths: the narrative capacity, the disruptive capacity, and the electoral capacity. Allow me to quote her. Narrative capacity refers to the ability of the movement to frame its story on its own terms, to spread its worldview. And the fact that Lawfare PH has trended gives us a taste of what it means to be able to push our story and let other people share our perspective. We might think of narrative capacity as persuasion or legitimacy, key ideological pillars of any social movement. Disruptive capacity describes whether a movement can interrupt the regular operations of a system of authority. So Dr. Bellio's idea that maybe it is time to go on a hunger strike, I think illustrates that point. I think back to April 1976, 77, when we had the noise barrage. Perhaps it's time to try that again. If you have doubts about the surveys, this might be a way to show that people are in fact behind Senator De Lima. To resume, finally, electoral or institutional capacity refers to a movement's ability to keep politicians from being elected, re-elected, or nominated unless they adopt and pursue policies friendly to the social movement's agenda, or the ability to force changes in institutions. Let me end on something that Dr. Bellio noted, that combating warfare requires probably a psychological adjustment rather than anything else. And perhaps we can hurdle that psychological barrier by thinking in terms of this three-fold framework. We need to build our narrative capacity, change the story. We need to build our electoral capacity, and I'm very glad that Ana Santos earlier made a special mention of Chel Jokno's brilliant showing in the last election. But lastly, we need to build our disruptive capacity to signal to the powers that be the strength of the democratic resistance. Thank you.
Thank you.